opinion or hypothesis or just belief. So once this was out and the opinion was forming that around the probability of the government knowing that Netaji was alive, this is when things started turning definitely towards the third hypothesis, which was a hypothesis till then. And we started, that is the time we realized that it's time to tell the entire truth regarding the third hypothesis to the country. We have seen the evidence about this hypothesis from very early on, and after much deliberation, initial uncertainty, we came to the conclusion that it was the third hypothesis where the truth was. And this is after all this happened and the declassification happened, that is when we started putting it together in the form of evidence. And not in the central government's domain or not in Calcutta, but something else had happened a few years ago in the Allahabad High Court. In 2013, the Allahabad High Court had gone through the evidence presented to the court and asked the state government, the Akhilesh Yadav government, to investigate this third hypothesis. Now, what is this third hypothesis? Let me tell you in the crux of it. The crux of the third hypothesis is that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose did not die in the plane crash on 18th of August 1945. He escaped to Russia, lived there for some time, initially under duress, probably captivity, but later on as a state guest. He was let out after a few years. He came down, he was sent to China, formed an alliance with them. He was in good terms with the Chinese statesmen and came back to India sometime in the early 1950s. And from the early 1950s, he lived in various parts of Uttar Pradesh, starting with a place that we have been able to figure out as a place called Mainpuri. From there, he moved to Lucknow. From Lucknow, he moved to a place called Naimisharanya, currently known as Nimsar. From there, he came to Ayodhya, Faizabad district. Now it's Ayodhya district. He came to Ayodhya. From Ayodhya, he moved to Basti, which is in Sitapur district. From Basti, he came back to Ayodhya again, and his final place of stay was in Faizabad, where he breathed his last in 1985, on 16th of September 1985. During this entire period, he maintained an absolute secrecy, a cover, and no one except a handful of people were let out, were allowed to know about his existence. It was early in 1962 that his existence was known to his revolutionary followers in Bengal, and that also by an accident. There was this earlier, former revolutionary and legislator from Bengal called Professor Atul Sen. Professor Atul Sen was in Nimsar, and there he heard about a Bengali sadhu and went to meet him, and whatever interaction took place amongst them, he came back convinced that the sadhu was Subhash Chandra Bose. Now, that hermit, that saint, or the person living under the garb of a sadhu, had categorically told Sen that he should not divulge the information regarding his existence in Nimsar, in Naimisharanya. But Professor Sen did not listen to him. He did not obey his instruction. What he did, as soon as he came back, he wrote to Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, this is a letter to Nehru from an old comrade of his. Professor Sen was a very well-known person, a former revolutionary, a congressman, a legislator, and he was not just any Tom, Dick, Harry who was writing a fantastic letter to Nehru. So in the letter, Professor Sen informed Nehru that I have met somebody and I know that Subhash Chandra Bose is alive and he is in India and he is living in an undisclosed place in a location. But I cannot give you any further information. Before I give you any further information, I would like to know if there is any treaty between India, if India has committed that Subhash Chandra Bose, if he returns, will be handed over to the former Allied powers as a war criminal. Now, by any standards, this is an astounding letter coming from an old comrade, coming from a revolutionary, a legislator, a responsible, erudite person, a person well established in society in many forms. And he was a colleague of Pandit Nehru. So it was not a letter from a stranger. If Pandit Nehru really believed in his own theory that Subhash Bose was dead, what do you think should have been his response? His response should have been an admonition that what nonsense are you talking? Why are you even helping in spreading these theories? Hello, is somebody trying to say something?
No, please,
please carry on, please.
So that should have been the tone of his response. But what Pandit Nehru did was again equally astounding. He wrote a very meek response. He did not say anything about Professor Sen's information that Subhash Bose was living in India. He just said, okay, there is nothing like any treaty between India and other countries. Even if other countries ask, we will not hand over Subhash Bose as a war criminal. That's the end of it. So Professor Atul Sen also wrote back saying, okay, thank you. But again, Pandit Nehru's reaction gives away his knowledge apart from what he postured publicly. A similar case had surfaced a few around the same time, in 1962, in fact. In fact, 1962, from 1961, actually, the case blew up in Bengal. This was confined to Bengal. The news spread to other parts of India, but the maximum hue and cry was centered in Bengal, mostly in Kolkata, and a very remote place called Sholmari in Jalpaiguri district of West Bengal. Another sadhu had made an ashram there and started living from 1959. And one of Subhash Bose's very old comrades, associates, went there, met the sadhu, and came back with the claim that this sadhu was no one but Subhash Bose himself. Now, it created such a huge hue and cry that hundreds and thousands of people started going to that place to find out the truth. They mobbed the ashram. Of course, the ashram was very well built. It was well secured. It had its own security force, and people were not allowed inside. And the sadhu who was there, living there, he never showed his face, at least initially. So when the hue and cry started, after some time, the sadhu gave out a declaration that I am not Subhash Bose. I am a different person. So don't believe in all these rumors. But things started evolving, changing. The way people went there, the kind of people who went there started, showed another possibility, showed another reality. So people were in two minds. A segment of old revolutionaries in Kolkata started believing that, and some of them did not believe at all. But what was Pandit Nehru's reaction to this? Well, for a person, if he really believed that Subhash Bose was dead in 1945, he should have entirely ignored it. But what happened? First thing that happened is that through the West Bengal government, an entire camp of intelligence officers were set up. The intelligence officers camped in and around the Sholmari ashram. There were daily flow of letters, telegrams between Falakata, the Sholmari area, and the headquarters in Kolkata. And this information was passed on to Delhi, to the central government. And all these exchanges, all these letters, all these telegrams that were exchanged between the local officers and the state government bureaucrats and the central bureaucrats, the intelligence bureau, the CID, crime branch, special branch, and the local district information intelligence department. It is a voluminous files. Luckily, we have been able to see that file. And I would make it a point to inform you that that file, which exists and we have seen it with our own eyes, is still classified. It's still not declassified. And even after that, the government stands on the floor of the parliament and claims that all files related to Netaji have been declassified, which is a absolute rubbish, absolute lie. Now, apart from this investigation by intelligence officers, what happened is Pandit Nehru sent a personal emissary to Sholmari Ashram. That emissary was a revolutionary from Bengal, one of the earliest persons who inducted Subhas Bose into the revolutionary movement. His name was Surendra Mohan Ghosh. Surendra Mohan Ghosh was later the president of Bengal Congress and a very, 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 very close person to Pandit Nehru. Surendra Mohan Ghosh actually, in fact, believed that Pandit Nehru was a modern avatar of Sri Krishna. So that was his devotion to Pandit Nehru. Surendra Mohan Ghosh was sent to Sholmari Ashram to verify whether the sadhu who lived there was Subhash or not. So that tells us, shows us the reality regarding Panditji's knowledge and belief, what he believed and what he said in public. His belief, his own knowledge about Subhas Bose's death. That although he postured publicly that Subhas was dead, he knew in the heart of his heart that that was not what the truth was. Now, coming back to this story, now there was a segment of revolutionaries in Kolkata who did not believe the Sholmari story. Because a person was sent, I mean, one of the biggest, two of the biggest revolutionary societies, Kolkata is known, Bengal, not Kolkata, not everything is Kolkata centric in Bengal. The revolutionary movement was quite well spread. So two or three of the biggest revolutionary groups in Bengal were the Anushilan Samiti, the Sri Sangha, and the Jugantar. Now, Anushilan Samiti and Sri Sangha, the revolutionaries who belonged to these groups, were still pretty active in the 1960s and 70s. They used to meet, many of them were in politics, and they used to meet. The leader, many of them had joined the Socialist Party, the Praja Socialist Party, PSP at that time. And the leader of the party at that time in Bengal was Leela Roy. Leela Roy was a firebrand revolutionary. She was much ahead of her time, a feminist. She was the first student of Dhaka University, first lady student of Dhaka University. She topped the graduation in her batch. She was the first one to do that. And she topped post-graduation from the university. A champion of women's rights. She organized women around various social activities and revolutionary activities. She promoted women's education. And so much has been her contribution towards India's freedom struggle. And she is still seen as with great admiration and respect in Bengal and in Bangladesh as well, from where she came. Leela Roy was the leader, and Leela Roy was Subhash Chandra Bose's right-hand person. While Bose was in India, active in Congress politics, after he quit Congress, he formed Forward Bloc. Leela and her husband Anil Roy, these two people were Bose's closest associates. Leela Roy knew Subhash Bose from around 1923. They were pretty close in their age, not much difference. And the kind of person that Leela Roy was, that she was not given to hero worship. Although she uh, had high regards and huge respect for Subhash Bose, she would not treat him as a superior or as a boss. They were more or less in equal terms while Bose was in India. That was their equation. So Leela Roy was the leader of Project Socialist Party in the 1960s. What they did, they met, they got together and decided that they would send their own man to find out who this Shalmali Sadhu was. And they selected a man who had seen Subhash Bose alive the last time among all of them. This man was an intelligence agent of the INA, the Indian National Army. He was trained as a saboteur. He was trained as an agent of the INA, was handpicked by Netaji to be sent from Southeast Asia into India to contact all the revolutionary groups, to do the groundwork for an insurrection, so that when the INA comes to the northeast border of the country, there is another thrust from Bengal. So that was the purpose. This man's name was Pavitra Mohan Roy. Now, Pavitra Mohan Roy came to India in 1945. He reached in 1945. 1944. He was arrested and awarded the death sentence. After a lot of lobbying by Mahatma Gandhi and others, and also the war coming to an end, he was granted amnesty, and his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. But towards the end of 1946, he was released and he came back to normal life. He was a doctor by profession. He started his practice. He joined politics. He became later he became a chairman of the municipality where he lived, and also a member of Bengal's legislative assembly. So this man, Pavitra Mohan Roy, was selected and sent to Shalmari. He went there, spent a couple of days, met the Sadhu face to face, and he became back sure that he was not Subhash Bose. And he informed his team accordingly. Now, once Atul Sen came back and informed about the Sadhu in Nimsa, it was again decided that it would be Pavitra Mohan Roy who would be sent. Pavitra Mohan Roy went to Nimsa, spent 2-3 months trying to meet the Sadhu, and it was not possible. It was only after 2-3 months that he got a chance to interact, not see face to face, but interact with the Sadhu. And he came back and gave his report to his colleagues. And he had no doubt about his assessment. From then onwards, Leela Roy got a very small core team of people extremely loyal to her, and started sending material for his physical well-being, for the Sadhu's physical well-being. And that's how the connection remained. Leela Roy died in 1972, although she was incapacitated much before that. She had a second stroke, and from I think 1967 or 68, from around that time, she was, or even before that, she was bedridden, and she couldn't get a chance. She went to Nimsar once, but could not meet the Sadhu, the Anam Sant. Came back, and it was subsequently Pavitra Mohan Roy and the team that Roy had set up, who kept in touch constantly for the next 2.5 decades with this unnamed saint. So this story came out for the first time. It had come out in Uttar Pradesh in 1985 after the saint's death. And that is when, because he had no name and nobody knew his exact identity, but everybody suspected that he was Subhash Bose in disguise, he was given the name Gumnami Baba. That name stuck. And there is something about language. I mean, what is accepted in one region of the country becomes difficult, or not really sophisticated or tasteful in other part of a country. So Gumnami Baba, although it has its own connotation, its nuances, and is a name that gained currency in Uttar Pradesh, Gumnami Baba in Bangla has a different connotation. So in Bengal, whenever the people hear that name, Gumnami Baba, they react differently. I mean, firstly, what is a Baba? Gumnami. I mean, this all sounds very so weird and so absurd. A man like Subhash Bose, a lion like him, living Gumnam, hiding, running for his life. I mean, that doesn't gel. So the first reaction is everywhere that of disbelief, that of uh, mockery, and dismissal. But then we start looking at the evidence. Justice Mukherjee did that to a great extent. He made our job easy to a great extent. Justice Mukherjee, after 1985, when the story broke out in Uttar Pradesh about him, about this Anam Sant, about Gumnami Baba, or Bhagwanji, as his followers used to call him. Some even called him Pardewala Baba. So there were various names because there was no name. So he was addressed by various names. After 85, 86, the matter fizzled out in Uttar Pradesh. When the story broke, one lady visited Faizabad. This lady was the daughter of Suresh Chandra Bose. I had asked you at the very beginning to remember this name, Suresh Chandra Bose, Netaji's elder brother, who had submitted his own dissentient report. He was a part of the Shahnawaz committee, but he submitted his dissentient report telling the government that the story of the plane crash was fake, it was a hoax, and Bose did not die in that plane crash. His daughter visited Faizabad in 1986, and she went through all the belongings of Bhagwanji or Gumnami Baba. He saw the handwritings. She found the original summons issued to her father, Suresh Chandra Bose, by the Khosla Commission. She found a handwriting on a note. She found a note, the handwriting which she believed to be her mother's. And she looked at things and she found that this man, the description of him, his belongings, his writings, his books, his other material, all point out that very likely this was her uncle. So she ran from pillar to post. She ran to the district administration. She went to the chief minister. All of them threw up their hands and nobody cooperated. The chief minister at that time advised her that she should approach the court. And so she did. She went to the Allahabad High Court. She pointed out to the findings of the newspaper journalistic investigations. She pointed out to the material found there. And she told the court that if this person is proved to be my uncle, then I claim the legacy. I claim the ownership of all this material. They belong to me. So the court, Indian courts, it's unbelievable that you will get quick justice. It takes months, years to get a hearing on any case. And it's terribly slow. It's very, very well known, the judicial process, how slow it is. But what happened in this case is the day after Lalita Bose, daughter of Suresh Chandra Bose, filed the petition, the next day, the court passed an interim order. The court directed the state government to preserve each and every material after making an exhaustive list of each and every item that was found in the place where Bhagwanji or Gumnami Baba lived last. It was a house called Ram Bhavan in Faizabad. So everything that was recovered, found in Ram Bhavan, was to be listed and preserved by the state government till further orders were given. Things were moving. I mean, the number of items that were found, it took the officials, the government officials, about a year to make the list of all these items. Now, after this case was, this interim order was passed, nothing moved. The state government took around 14 years to give its own response. That tells a lot about the government's intentions, be it the state government, be it the central government. So the state government replied in the late 1990s, responded in the late 1990s, nearly 14 years after the interim order. And it was in 2013 that the Allahabad High Court finally passed its direction. The direction had two parts. The order of the Allahabad High Court in 2013 had two parts. The first part said that these belongings of Bhagwanji or Gumnami Baba must be preserved in a museum. Now, there are hundreds and thousands of unknown sants, unknown sadhus who die every year. Their entities, their identities are not even known. They are cremated. And the story finishes there. Now, this is a high court, a state high court, Allahabad High Court, asking the state government to erect a museum out of the belongings of Gumnami Baba. So just try to grasp the seriousness and the magnitude of the order. Why would it do so? I mean, would it do so for any Tom, Dick, and Harry? Would it do so for any Baba? I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of Babas in our country. I mean, that's while some of them are highly respected and regarded, many charlatans become, there are many charlatans who just, I mean, milk it as a business. They defraud people and they live as Babas and do all sorts of things. Now, why would a high court engage itself, busy itself with a Baba, unless it has a hunch as to the identity of the Baba? Now, the court did not pass an order on the identity of the Baba because it made it very clear that the petitioners had not asked the court to pass an order on that. So the court refrained from passing an order on that matter. But apart from asking the government to set up a museum, it also directed the government to consider setting up a new commission of inquiry, specifically looking into the identity, to establish the identity of this person, the identity of Gumnami Baba Bhagwanji Anamsan Pardewala Baba, whoever he was. Now, the government deterred for 3 years and nothing was happening. Then our friends in Lucknow, and he is currently not so active, but at that time he was very active, Adhir Som, who wrote later a book called Gumnami Baba, a case study. He was active. He helped us a lot in connecting with the Chief Minister, Akhilesh Yadav. Netaji's grand niece, Janti Rakshit, Janti, her sister, her brother, and Janti's husband, they accompanied us to meet Akhilesh Yadav. Akhilesh Yadav was very nice. He received us warmly, gave us an audience for, I think, more than 2 hours, discussed everything, and within a few weeks, he announced that there would be a commission of inquiry. So 3 years after the court order, there was a commission of inquiry. I'll come back to the work of the commission of inquiry later, probably during the Q&A session. This was set up under the retired Justice Vishnu Sahai, the Sahai Commission. But going back to Justice Mukherjee's findings, Justice Mukherjee had gone through all the evidence, the material that was recovered, the eyewitnesses who were alive, and he was extremely stringent in culling out, in passing through the evidence. So he relied mostly on the evidence given by people who had seen both Subhash Chandra Bose and the Baba, Subhash Chandra Bose and Gumnami Baba. There were other witness accounts who had seen Gumnami Baba but had not seen Subhash Chandra Bose. He rejected their evidence, which might sound very illogical because, I mean, I can bet that if I see Chiranjeevi on road, I will not make a mistake in identifying him. If I see Amitabh Bachchan on road, I will not make a mistake. If I see Sunil Gavaskar on road, I will not make a mistake. For that does not make it essential for me to have known them or met them personally beforehand. But Justice Mukherjee insisted that he wanted to be absolutely sure and absolutely correct on this. He wanted to make no mistake. So he insisted that only those people's witness account will be accepted who had seen Gumnami Baba and who had before seen Subhash Bose. And he also relied on the letters and the presence of former revolutionaries. There was Leela Roy, there was Pabitra Mohan Roy, there were other people. I would not take the names right now because that most of you won't be able to relate to them. But there were at least 10 people who had been associates of Subhash Bose and who were in touch with Bhagwanji. So their presence, regular presence, year after year, their letters, all those recovered, he assessed them and reached the conclusion that there is no reason not to rely on the evidence produced by these people. They are substantial, they are accurate, but there is a problem. If he accepted their evidence, the conclusion straightforward was that Gumnami Baba and Netaji were the same person. And he was going towards that. But there was a problem. The problem was with forensic tests. Justice Mukherjee, while going through the belongings of Gumnami Baba, found a matchbox in which there were 7 teeth. He sent the teeth for a set of forensic tests for DNA testing and comparing the DNA samples found in the teeth with the family members of Netaji. And from the voluminous writing samples that he recovered, he sent them for an assessment of handwriting comparison. So these were sent, the handwritings were sent to 2 government laboratories and 1 independent expert. And the DNA sample was first sent to a lab in Hyderabad, the CDFD. And when the CDFD could not be certain of its findings, its tests were inconclusive. They could neither find a match nor difference. It was inconclusive. They could not get enough DNA sample to conduct a reasonable test. The samples were returned and the Mukherjee Commission sent those samples again to the Central Forensic Science Laboratory in Kolkata. The Kolkata lab did that test, compared the DNA extracted from those teeth, compared them with Netaji's family members, and gave its report that the DNA does not match. The DNA samples do not match. So obviously, it was clear as daylight that Gumnami Baba was not Netaji, he was a different person. Now, in the handwriting analysis case, the samples which were sent to the independent expert, who was Bilal Kapoor. Bilal Kapoor was a former chief examiner of Christian documents with the government of India, and a very, very well-known person and well-respected person. He became famous with the St. Kitts forgery case. Those who keep a tab on political developments in the country would remember this happened at the time of when VP Singh was the prime minister. The St. Kitts forgery case, he became famous with that, his handwriting analysis. Now, Bilal Kapoor studied hundreds of samples, made a detailed case, took out alphabets, letters, Bengali letters, English letters, compared them, hundreds of them, blew them up and showed the comparison. And he reached like hundreds of samples he compared. He reached the conclusion that the handwriting was a match. The handwriting of Gumnami Baba was the same as handwriting of Netaji. So the 2 people were same. But the government labs gave a different opinion. The Forensic Science Laboratory in Kolkata gave a 1-page report. two-page report, in fact, but the first page was always the address written and to whom it was addressed. So it was in essence a one-page report, a one-paragraph report saying that our opinion is that the handwriting samples don't match. There was no exhibit, no reason given, no analysis shown, just opinion that handwritings don't match. The lab in Shimla showed some fuzzy samples, and if I show you, that's why I said that I wish I was standing in front of you and showing you the samples. If you look at the samples, they would find, as a layperson, more match than difference. So the Shimla lab said that the handwritings don't match. So it was a 2-1 majority in the negative. So Justice Mukherjee was stuck. He was absolutely convinced by the evidence, witness accounts, but the forensic tests stood on his way. He could not reach the conclusion or write it down that they were the same person. So in his report, he wrote that there is no reason not to rely upon the witness evidence, especially of those who have met Subhash Chandra Bose and have seen the face of Gumnami Baba. There are some important obstacles in the way of reaching that conclusion. And these were the reasons, the forensic test results. When we met, once the report was submitted, the government rejected, and both the dispute that was mounted about the plane crash story and the third hypothesis about Gumnami Baba, these were successfully brushed aside by the government. We met Justice Mukherjee. I met him personally. Anuj met him personally. And we had long talks. And we have maintained our contact with him. In fact, we met him later part of last year. He told us that he suspected foul play in the forensic labs. He told us categorically that he was told that the samples had matched, but when he received the reports, the printed written reports, signed reports, they were different. But as a judge, as a person presiding a commission of inquiry, his hands were tied by the report of a government lab, because that is a government commission of inquiry would rely on, a government lab's report. Even with the knowledge that there have been significant doubt cast on the workings of our forensic labs, government-owned forensic labs, there have been strictures passed by the Delhi High Court. There have been actions taken by the CBI, and it's now well known to what extent incompetence and corruption can interfere with the results. The commission's hands were tied because they were government institutions and they were in majority. So we wondered what can be done. This is when after this, the Allahabad High Court order came, and the Allahabad High Court order justifiably raised a doubt about the forensic test results. Now, a commission of inquiry has a status of a sessions court, and when its findings are questioned by the higher court, by a high court, the high court has a higher status than the commission of inquiry. So it overrules the findings of a commission of inquiry. And the Allahabad High Court questioned the Mukherjee Commission's reliance on the forensic tests. First, it questioned the assumption that the teeth which were found in Gumnami Baba's belongings were actually his, because there was no evidence. It was an assumption. There was no eyewitness. There was no clinching evidence. I mean, people who tend to dismiss the Gumnami Baba hypothesis, Gumnami Baba angle, they always tend to bring out this argument about clinching evidence, because that is what Justice Mukherjee wrote in his report. That in the absence of clinching evidence, he could not reach a conclusion that Gumnami Baba and Netaji were the same person. So there was no clinching evidence that the set of teeth which were tested for DNA were Gumnami Baba's. And the Allahabad High Court also criticized the Mukherjee Commission for not assessing the documents available in Ram Bhavan, which were in the custody of the government, state government. As evidence, they could have thrown much more light. So we took our cue to this, cue from this, and when we met with Akhilesh Yadav, we apprised him of these facets, and we met once the commission was set up. Justice Vishnu Sahai commission was set up. We met Justice Vishnu Sahai, gave him a very detailed briefing personally, Anuj and me, and Srijit was present with us. Jayanti Rakshit was present with us, and we gave him a detailed briefing. And Anuj and I jointly presented him an affidavit which was nearly 70, 80 pages, detailed out the case, detailed out the loopholes, asked him to recommended. We can't ask him, we can only recommend. We recommended that there were certain aspects that he should look into for a fair and free investigation. And the other plan of action, we gave him a detailed plan of action as to what could be done. To our dismay, we found that when the report was out, actually within a year, it became very clear to us that the whole exercise was a farce. It was not an investigation, it was a show of an investigation, and there was literally no effort from the commission, by the commission, to investigate. The commission did not ask for government records. It did not ask for even Uttar Pradesh government's files, the police files, the intelligence files. It did not summon witnesses, key witnesses. Even the basic advertisement informing people of the country that the commission was set up was issued many, many months later. So we got a hang that we can't expect much from this commission, and it's probably going to end up in the same way. And our suspicion was vindicated when the report came out last year in 2019. And but what happened is that we took the case once we understood that the commission is not going anywhere. We decided, Anuj and I decided, that we should do our own investigation. We should complete it. Whatever evidence we have, we should put it together and present to the people of the country. And that is how Conundrum came into being. What we had done is, in the meantime, while all this was going on, we had, by a stroke of luck, with the help of the granddaughter of Pavitra Mohan Roy, the man who was Bhagwanji's, Gumnami Baba's right-hand man for 30 years, and the man whom Netaji had handpicked for his mission to India, Pavitra Mohan Roy's youngest son's daughter, helped us get all the letters, hundreds of them, the letters written by Bhagwanji, by Gumnami Baba to Pavitra Mohan Roy. Because I had got already got the exhibits related to Justice Mukherjee Commission earlier, I had the letters written by Pavitra Mohan Roy himself to Bhagwanji, but I did not have the other side. So when Roy's granddaughter helped us to get those letters, the first thing we did is to pick up some samples from those letters and send them for assessment of handwriting to an American expert. Why American expert? First, this expert was selected by our friends Abhishek Bose and Deepak Nijawan in the US as one of the topmost expert in the US. Secondly, he had no inkling about India's history, politics, and would not meddle and would not be influenced. So we did not tell him, when we sent him the samples of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and Gumnami Baba, we did not tell him what this is all about. We just told him, gave him a sketch, a very rough sketch from which he could not have guessed or made out in any way that we are talking about Netaji. and we are talking about this case. So he just had some samples of handwriting from Gumnami Baba and from Netaji. That's all he had. And he gave an extremely detailed report. He followed a methodology which is followed by the FBI, and he found a perfect match. Not only that, he drew up a character sketch of Gumnami Baba, which we knew from our research was very close to the personality of the man himself. That was astounding. We wanted to get a second opinion. We wanted to be sure, doubly sure. So we approached another top Indian expert and we gave him the same samples. He did the analysis, handwriting assessment, and came to the same conclusion. And we were left wondering, what is this case about? That whenever we approach independent experts, the results are affirmative. And whenever something comes from the government or government-owned labs, the results are negative. What is the government hiding? Till date. Why? Now, something funny happened with the DNA. The DNA test results were still there. The CFSL results, which had categorically ruled out the DNA samples of Gumnami Baba being that of Netaji, it had ruled out completely. It said that the DNA samples don't match. So we were wondering, I mean, that's an open and shut case. And that's how it should be. That's how we perceive science to be. But what we ignore when we look at such application of science is the politics behind it. When we dug deeper, we found something very curious. We found that, now I will tell you about the timeline. The report was sent to the CFSL in November or December 2003. And the report, analysis report, the findings of CFSL came back to the commission in June 2004. So that's a clear 7 to 8 months. When that test was done, the report was written, and it took time. And all this while, it was absolutely secret exercise. The results, the envelope that contained the results was opened by Justice Mukherjee in a public forum in front of everybody. Till then, no one had any idea. Now, what we found very, very intriguing is that a leading newspaper in Bengal, published from Kolkata, a Bangla newspaper, published around the same time that the samples were sent to CFSL, that the DNA samples had not matched. We could have taken it as an over-enthusiastic reporter's work. As the work of an over-enthusiastic reporter. But then we looked into the commission's records. The commission took exception and took the newspaper and the reporter to the Press Council of India. In the Press Council, the newspaper argued, defended itself, said that this is journalistic scoop. It's a journalistic investigation. And this is a standard journalistic procedure. Scoops are a basis of journalism, and that's normal, standard, and there can nothing be objectionable about it. So all that is very nice, all that is fine. The question that avoided everybody's attention was that a scoop is possible when an event has occurred. You can print a scoop when something has happened. You cannot print a scoop before it has happened. Forget the results being out of the DNA test being done by the CFSL. In all probability, when the newspaper had published its report, the CFSL in all probability had not even started the analysis part of it. So then how could the newspaper know the results 6 months ahead of time? I mean, did they have a time travel facility? Were they tantric siddhas who could see the future? Or was it something more imaginable and understandable, that there was a collusion, that reports were leaked out, that conclusion was premeditated? This was a Congress supporter newspaper, and nearing to be a mouthpiece of the Congress party. So it's no surprise that they knew the results 6 months before the results were out. To buttress our case, we asked the lab for an electropherogram of the test. Now, many of you might not know what an electropherogram is. Many of you would know, but for those who don't know, an electropherogram is a chart. When DNA samples are extracted, they are fed into a machine, and it's a machine which reads the DNA sequence. And here there is no human intervention, as like it's not the DNA sequence is not drawn by hand. It's the machine which gives you a printout. It reads the DNA sequence and prints it out on a piece of paper. Analysts, scientists analyze that printout and then reach a conclusion. So it is like for a simple analogy, it's like your blood test report, it's like your X-ray, it's like your any other medical report. You need a report. The doctor will read that report and then reach a conclusion. He will tell you what is wrong, what has happened, what is going on. Same way, the DNA lab will read that printout and then reach a conclusion. So the raw format is that printout, that X-ray report or this electropherogram. That's the raw format. Now, just like if you are not happy with the analysis, the diagnosis of one doctor, you take the same X-ray report or the same blood report and go and visit another doctor. You take a second because you are not satisfied with the diagnosis of your first doctor. The same should happen or is possible in the case of a DNA test. If you want to verify the analysis and the conclusions of one set of scientists, you can take that electropherogram and go to another set of scientists and tell them, look, I want a proper reading of this chart. Now, this is what I have got from one set of scientists. Can you tell me what your assessment, what your evaluation is, what your conclusion is? So the case would be solved pretty easily if that electropherogram can be taken to an independent set of scientists. Just as we did with the handwriting samples. We took them to independent experts and got their evaluation. We wanted to take this electropherogram to an independent set of scientists and get their opinion, their views. So we asked the Central Forensic Science Laboratory, the CFSL, that please give us the electropherogram, and this is a public record and there should be no reason for hiding it. The CFSL told us, sorry, we cannot give it to you because this belonged to a third party whose interests might be harmed, and all the spiel that is written down in the Right to Information Act, they vomited it on paper and gave us, the banal excuse that the apparently Gumnami Baba's commercial and private interests would be harmed if they share the electropherogram. Now the point is, Gumnami Baba's identity is not even known. He's dead in 1985, and you are telling me that you know his interests would be harmed without knowing who that person is. Moreover, their logic does not stand scrutiny because all records belonging to the Justice Mukherjee Commission of Inquiry have been made public by the government itself. And CFSL is a government institution. It can, without batting an eyelid, it can safely give out the electropherogram unless there is something to hide there. They said they repeatedly refused, and this is where it struck. They were hiding something. Now, last year, our friend, young friend in Kolkata, Shayak Sen, he asked again for the electropherogram. And surprise of surprise, this time the CFSL said, oh, we have lost it. We don't have it. The question is, how did you lose? And there was a hue and cry in electronic media. There were TV debates. There was newspaper debates. Unfortunately, we live in a society where the government responds only if they see something on TV or if they see something on newspaper, printed on newspaper. The basic concern about people or even our heroes don't matter to anyone. That's the unfortunate truth. So when this thing again broke out, the CFSL was bound to retract its statement. This again sent a fresh letter after a few weeks and said that, oh, we made a search after we saw your news and read the report, and now we have found the electrophotogram, but again, we cannot give it to you. So that is the game they are playing. That is where we stand today. This is the truth of the DNA test. And I said I will come back to the Justice Sahai Commission's conclusion. Justice Sahai Commission concluded that this man was not Netaji, probably he was Netaji's follower. And why? How did it reach the conclusion that he was not Netaji? Because Justice Sahai relied completely on the findings of the DNA test, ignoring the strictures passed by the High Court, on whose order the commission itself was set up. The commission was set up because the High Court found the DNA tests to be unreliable. And the first thing that the commission does after being set up is to rely on that same DNA test, which has been called into question. He did not ask for the electrophotogram. He did not call even Justice Mukherjee as a witness. That was extremely important because Justice Mukherjee had inadvertently given out his personal belief on camera, which was televised throughout the country in 2010. That, although he could not prove it, it was his personal belief. He was 100% convinced that Gumnami Baba and Netaji were the same person. It was Subhash Chandra Bose, who had returned to India, was living in Uttar Pradesh, who was later given the name Gumnami Baba. He, as a judge, as a Supreme Court judge of many years standing, as a Chief Justice of Allahabad High Court, as a criminal lawyer who is highly regarded, it was his considered opinion, only that he could not prove it on pen and paper. That is where we stand today. That is we were making progress, but unfortunately, this terrible state of affairs took over. COVID-19 has taken over everything else. And like everything else, this had to take a backseat, because right now our concern is our own safety, our well-being, even survival. So hopefully once we are out of this state of affairs, we will again take it up and take it to the logical conclusion. So that's all. I mean, I can go on for hours and hours and probably even days, but then time is limited, and I think that's all I wanted to tell you. If there is any information which you would like to know, I think we can open up for questions, and I would be most happy to take your question.